Hey guys, this episode of Pounds to Kilos is brought to you by Athena. Some of you might be wondering, what is Athena? Well, let me give you some context. The Greek god Prometheus molded man from clay, but it was the goddess Athena that breathed life into them. Athena exists to give life back to entrepreneurs on both sides of the globe through virtual assistant services. Sick of managing all the smaller tasks inside of your business? Looking for ways to scale your business and get back in your life? Athena has you covered. Guys, I can't speak highly enough of the experience that I've had with Athena. It's just for somebody who's trying to start a podcast and doesn't know much about this world. I've just had somebody who's been there to take care of the mundane tasks, the tasks that drained me emotionally, that drained my time, my energy. And the lines of communication are really, really easy. And it feels good to know that there's somebody, from a developing country that is got some work and I'm sort of providing that. So I can't speak highly enough about having a virtual assistant from Athena, and you should definitely jump on to athena.co and use the promo code POUNDS when booking a demo for 20 hours of a free virtual assistant services. Enjoy this episode. Alrighty folks, welcome to a new episode of Pounds to Kilos. I can't decide if it's like more of a statement to take glasses off like this or to put them on to read something, but either way I think I'll be taking my glasses off and on throughout this episode. For those that are listening to the podcast, you'll have no idea what I'm talking about, but that is okay. Team, welcome to another episode. I thought I'd do an episode. My goal with all the episodes is to try and do something that I feel is rearing its head in the community at this point in time. And at the moment, just post CrossFit Games, it just feels like there's so many local competitions that are being offered, whether they be online competitions, whether they be qualifiers for a competition that is later in the year, or whether they be competitions that are actually being performed at affiliates, like weekend competitions or something like that. So I thought today's episode, what I'd do is, look, I've been involved in CrossFit competitions for a fair while on a number of levels, and I thought I'd just sort of discuss the different types of competitions there are, and then, not necessarily the positives and negatives of them, because I think you can make up your mind as to whether or not you decide it's a positive or negative, but just the characteristics of a different type of competition and what you can expect. And maybe you're thinking of running a competition at your affiliate, or thinking of running a competition online or something like that. And you can just getting a sense of what the landscape is like gives you some indication of maybe where there's a hole for you to run a competition, or where you might try and do some sort of competition. So just to give you some background of my experience of competitions, I've been in competitions. I've done individual and team competitions, not at a particularly high level. I've done a few of the sort of, I guess you'd call them like national affiliate series type competitions. Individually, I've just done some local comps. I've ran some local comps, both team and individual, at an affiliate level, and then I've been involved in the high level comps for from a media point of view, or an MC point of view. So yeah, I feel like I've got a nice level of experience, and I see how they work behind the scenes, and probably most importantly, I get to see what type of experience the athletes have. And that is not to be undersold, because people often come up to me as a coach, and that's the other way I've experienced competitions as a coach, and sort of, they're asking about competitions. And ultimately, I do want the athlete to be challenged, but I'm thinking to myself, what's the best experience that this athlete can get? What do they need from competition, from the experience of a competition? And are they going to get that from the competition that they want to enter into, or are they not? And it's fair to say that I think there's a competition probably out there for everybody at the right time, and no competition is good or bad. It just suits the individual in terms of what they're actually looking for. Of course, things like logistics and programming, you can have your individual opinion on that, but that's not necessarily what this episode is about. How to program a good comp. There's information out there about that, or it could be another episode that we could have at some stage. So let's, without further ado, discuss sort of the different categories of competitions that exist. Some of them are going to be very obvious to you. Others are okay, I haven't really thought that is a particular sort of topic or particular type of competition, if you will. The first one is obviously sanctionals. So there are a number of sanctionals available to Australians. I'd say that the main two are the Australian CrossFit Championships and the Down Under CrossFit Championships. There's also two in China, the Asian CrossFit Championships, and it's the Panda CrossFit Championship. I think it's a slightly different name. Sorry, I'll apologise to those organising it, but that's actually earlier in the season this year. So sanctionals competition. What are the characteristics of a sanctionals competition? Well, first of all, from a programming point of view, we know that sanctionals are going to be heavy. Well, not necessarily, but they definitely have the scope to be heavy, and they have the scope to put complex gymnastics in there. What else can sanctionals do that most other competitions can't? They can normally do odd object workouts, and the reason for that is that they can just afford to buy a bucket load of an odd object, whatever that thing might be. And they also can do outdoor workouts pretty frequently. So whether that be using the ocean, which both of the Australian CrossFit Championships did, or using something like the mountains, which is what some of the sanctionals, particularly the one in South Africa, did. So from a programming point of view, I think the sanctionals really sets itself apart with its ability to do more things that look like, obviously the CrossFit Games. Okay, what are some things about the sanctionals that people potentially don't consider as an experience for an athlete? Well, there's a lot of red tape involved in sanctionals. I've worked behind the scenes at regionals and sanctionals now for the last 6 years. And the red tape is, I'm not criticizing it, it's totally and utterly necessary. But what you need to understand as an athlete that's going to be involved in something like that is that there's a huge amount of waiting around. There's a huge amount of athlete briefs. There's long days, there's early mornings into late nights. And the vast majority of your weekend, or competition, if you will, is actually occupied with those things as opposed to being out on the floor. Now, when I say that, it doesn't sound super appealing, but I guess what you need to understand is that you're probably going to perform 6 to 7 workouts. A number of those workouts could be short, a number of them could be a little bit longer, but a huge amount of the mental, emotional energy of the weekend is spent in the warm-up area, in the stands, listening to the brief, in marshalling, in travel. The sanctionals are obviously in a particular location which most athletes need to travel for, unless you happen to be a local, which is very fortunate. So I guess from a sanctionals point of view, from a coach point of view, if you're preparing an athlete for sanctionals, just understand that there's a lot more preparation than simply making sure that the athlete is physically ready for the workout. There's a whole skill and an art, if you will, to the entire experience, which basically for a sanctional or something like the Down Under Championship, the event effectively begins for most athletes, I'd say about Thursday morning when they walk out their door to fly, and ends at about Sunday night or Sunday afternoon once they finally pack up their bag from their last event. So it's just a huge commitment, and obviously the thrill of a competition like that and the size of it and the level of athlete is something that hopefully it's obvious that that's the benefit of competing at something like sanctionals. But when sort of approaching it from a coaching point of view, it's just like, hey, I'd like this athlete to make sanctionals. Understand what you're getting them into in terms of the commitment of not only that weekend, but obviously the training that's required for all the different programming that I spoke of earlier. Okay, so that's sanctionals, and certainly there's some coaches and athletes listening right now that have the goal of making sanctionals. But if we move on to perhaps something that will appeal to a more broader part of the community, the second sort of category that I've got as a competition is high level non-sanctional. My goal throughout this episode was to not necessarily mention too many competitions because I don't want to be seen to be associated with any competition as such, or more so what I should say is this isn't about saying which competitions are good or which competitions are bad, but to give you an idea of what I see as high-level non-sanctional, I would say something like the Schwartz's challenge of previous years and also the Torian Pro, particularly of previous years. This year it looks like it's going to a new level in terms of the caliber of athlete that you're going to have. But that gives you an idea of the type of event that we're talking about now. Now, in terms of these high-level non-sanctional events, really, I think they offer all the things that sanctionals offer in terms of programming. Perhaps the capacity to do things outdoors isn't quite there, but certainly odd objects seem to be prevalent at competitions like this. The Chasing Better Throwdown in Perth would be another example of this. They had a lot of odd objects last year. But I guess one thing that should be noted is that probably, because they're not qualifiers for the CrossFit Games, or they don't have an invite to the CrossFit Games, that's the correct terminology, these events tend to avoid a little bit of that red tape that we talked about from a sanctionals perspective. So, you can decide which event you think is more appropriate for an athlete to be involved in, whether it's an official sanctional or something like this. But I think the experience of these particular events is much closer to like a local comp at a box, except it's got all the programming and athlete level of a sanctional. And that's a really nice combination in my humble opinion. I think that's a very appealing thing for an athlete to get some exposure to. What are some of the things that potentially an athlete doesn't necessarily think of when signing up to a competition like this? I think from my experience, I attended the Schwartz's Challenge a number of times, and I've looked online at the leaderboard for Torian Pro this year. I think people need to understand that the degree and the level of athlete is quite varied. So if you're going in there and you sort of understand that, okay, I'm going in to have a really good experience here, and I understand that those that are on the top of the leaderboard are in a completely different class to me almost, then I think you have a really good experience. But if you go in there sort of thinking, okay, I'd like to be really, really competitive, and you haven't actually had a look at who's competing at these events, that's when you really can have that experience of like, oh, I'm so far off the pace. Look, I said I didn't want to mention actual events, but I've already done that several times. Here's the example. The last Schwartz's Challenge that took place, I think it would have to be 2000. Look, the last one I was there for, Rob Forte won the Schwartz's Challenge, and then last year Brandon Swan won the Torian Pro. They're the two male winners, I should say, respectively. They're both individual CrossFit Games athletes. So don't be winning a local comp and then sort of thinking, right, I'm probably going to win the Torian Pro. That's sort of not how it works. So this is still a step up, and arguably the caliber of your athlete that you're going to come up against at something like these high level local comps is as high as sanctionals. I know at the Chasing Better Throwdown last year in the male category, Mitch Cinnamon, who was at the games the previous year, he came second. He didn't even win it. So just understand what you're up against when you go to these high level non-sanctional events. Let's talk about the next category that I've wrote down, and that is a Masters competition. I know that Masters it's sort of hard to categorize it as a separate style of competition. It's purely just taking a competition and making it only available to certain athletes. But I have noticed that there's particular characteristics to Masters comps which is unique. The first one is, I think when programmed well, and I have seen them programmed really well of late, the programming is just enough skill and to ensure that skill is being tested, whilst understanding that for Masters athletes, certain positions and certain mobility restrictions make high volume of particular skills problematic for that particular population. Now, I haven't actually spoke to the people who have programmed Masters events, but when I look at the Masters programming, that's the first thing that sticks out to me. It's like the things that people struggle with from a mobility perspective, they're there, but in limited volume, so that you can sort of express capacity in them if you have them, but not get completely ruined by them if you don't have them. So that's sort of the characteristic I noticed about Masters programming, is that it's a little bit more, how would I say, forgiving on people that potentially lack a skill or two, and that's quite nice. The other characteristic of a Masters competition that I have noticed is that I can see that from a Masters point of view, there's just a really strong community aspect to all of the Masters competitions that are going on. I think that's because there's some really key individuals that have been on that circuit for a long time, and they seem to really embrace the idea of, hey, this is a competition, but actually it's just really cool that we can all still throw down as we're getting into, I guess, older age, even though Masters are not that old. So I really like this aspect of the competition. I feel like the Masters events that I've been to are some of the strongest community events, and I would say that there's more and more competitors at Masters competitions who are there simply for the individual challenge of competing, as opposed to, I want to win this, or hey, I want to qualify for the next phase. There certainly is those competitors there, don't get me wrong, but I've just noticed that there's a lot of cool people there that are like, hey, like I know that I'm not going to finish particularly high today, I just need to do this because I need to prove to myself that as I'm getting to this age, I can still be involved in a competitive sort of competition. So I really like that characteristic of the Masters competitions. Let's move on. The fourth characteristic. This is an interesting one, and I'm seeing more and more of these type of competitions. I've written it as this: more of a fitness competition than a CrossFit competition. I suppose the characteristic of a competition like this is that it removes itself from offering it exclusively to CrossFitters. And how it does this is, normally there's a few key things that you see. First of all, it tends to not necessarily be at a CrossFit affiliate. So that would be sort of the most sort of black and white, like, hey, this is not just for CrossFitters. The second thing is that there tends to be, at the top end, so the most competitive athletes, a mixture of CrossFit athletes and non-CrossFit athletes. So people that are, we're a CrossFitter, we're at an affiliate, and then people who are not necessarily at an affiliate. The third thing is a programming perspective. I've found with these competitions, there tends to be, not necessarily, but tends to be the lack of a heavy weight or high skill in a conditioning piece. So they might test a heavy lift at some stage, but what they don't do is put, moderate to heavy weights in an actual workout. I think, or high skills in a workout. That, I guess, is really quintessential CrossFit. So it seems to be like they test the modalities almost individually. It's like, hey, are you strong? Let's test this lift. Okay, now can you huff and puff? Let's test you on a rower exclusively, or let's test you on a run and a swim exclusively. That's still CrossFit, isn't it? But it tends to avoid the mixed modality, and in particular the heavyweight, high skill thing. What's worth noting at this point, and this is actually something I meant to say earlier in the episode, is that there are no CrossFit competitions except the ones that are run by CrossFit HQ. I'm using the term loosely, CrossFit competition, as like a competition that's ran at an affiliate by a CrossFitter for CrossFitters. But even that, unless it's sanctioned or authorized by CrossFit HQ, it's not actually a CrossFit competition. It's just a fitness competition run by CrossFitters. That's the next category. And I guess sort of like one of the final categories we'll talk about, and this is the one that I guess started it all, the local affiliate competition. There's so many different ranges within the local affiliate competition. There's so many different expressions of a local affiliate competition. But I guess what you're bound to see at a local affiliate competition is, one, huge amounts of couplets and triplets involving gymnastics, weightlifting, and like huff and puff. Now, I know that sounds obvious. That's just CrossFit. But if you go to those local competitions, you're probably going to get 2 or 3 classic workouts like that. And then you're going to get some sort of heavy lift. And then typically they're like, okay, we need to test this high level skill, but we don't want people to not sign up for our comp. So we might test that at the end, or we might test it in a way that doesn't ruin people's workout or ruin their day. Look, one of the characteristics about these local competitions that I think is worth respecting is that it's really hard for us, and I've run these competitions, to attract high-level athletes without trying to scare people who don't have huge amounts of capacity. So the criticism becomes, it's like, oh, this person went to regionals or they've been to the CrossFit Games on a team. They shouldn't be competing at local comps. And I push back on that. It's like, hey, that's actually the coolest thing ever that you're competing against a CrossFit Games athlete right now. Why don't you enjoy that as opposed to, complaining that you're not ending up on the podium because they're here? You probably wouldn't have ended up on it anyway. That's not true. Sorry, I shouldn't attack anyone for that. To draw this back into the characteristic that I want to speak of is that at these local affiliate comps, it's really unknown as to what level of athlete you're going to get. I've been to comps before where I was expecting the level to be quite sort of moderate, if you will, and then I've gone up against athletes, like there's been several athletes there, I'm like, oh my God, I've definitely called you at regionals and now I'm competing against you. It's not something that I think we can fix, because you want the standards, you can put a standard for minimum requirements, hey, to do this competition, you're going to have a pretty shit time unless you can clean this, snatch this, you can do toes to bar, and you've got a few handstand push-ups. That's a very reasonable thing for anybody to put on those local affiliate comps. It doesn't make any sense to be like, hey, don't do this comp if you can deadlift 200 kilos because you're too strong for this comp. I just think that's not quite fair. I have seen examples where it's like, hey, this comp is not appropriate for anybody who went to regionals or finished in the top whatever in the open. I definitely can, to comps that have done that, not necessarily criticizing that. I definitely see the logic of that because I've heard and been involved in criticisms of comps where they're like, so-and-so shouldn't have been here. But the problem with that is I don't actually think that you can describe who shouldn't do a comp. Okay, put it this way. Rich Froning definitely shouldn't jump into the local in-house comp. But, maybe he should. But, just because you went to regionals on a team or sanctionals on a team doesn't mean that you're absolutely unstoppable and therefore, you shouldn't participate in a local comp. Just because you can deadlift 200 kilos doesn't mean you shouldn't participate in a local comp. In fact, that one's a bad example. Just because you finished in the top 100 in the open. I'm coaching an athlete currently that finished in the top 100 in the open, and she by her own admission would certainly know that there's lots of local comps where she would go to and she would be challenged by the workouts and challenged by the athletes. So it's a very grey area, and if you're running these competitions or participating in these competitions, I think what you need to be aware of is hey, I'd prefer us to get a high-level athlete who's potentially going to do really well at our comp, as opposed to err on the other side, which is, we don't want anyone who's got capacity coming here because then beginners will feel like they've had something taken away from them or that it wasn't fair that they were competing against these athletes. I'd say all power to those good athletes if they want to jump into those comps. And other people should enjoy competing against them. I know I certainly do when it's happened to me. Okay, that was a little bit of a rant about local affiliate comps, but just some stuff to think about. Ideally, that springs some ideas in mind and maybe sparks some conversation. Look, the last form of competition is one that's becoming more and more prevalent, and that's online competitions. Obviously, this is spawned because of the success of the CrossFit Open and that style of format. Look, one thing about these competitions that I've noticed from a characteristic point of view is that it can be quite lonely to do them. I think the competitions that are doing this are getting better and better at making sure they get video footage of the people who are doing these online competitions and sharing it so that we get a really good understanding of like, hey, there's a real competition going down here and look what so-and-so did, but then so-and-so did this an hour later. But it can sometimes feel like you're a little bit removed from the I guess, the cauldron of a competition type event. We talked about local comps prior to this. A good local comp at an affiliate, it actually feels like you're at the MCG and there's 70,000 people yelling at you when you're in a jam-packed gym and it's a Saturday afternoon and everyone's brought everyone from their local affiliate down. The online comp doesn't offer that, but I tell you what the online comp does offer, and this is something that it's definitely not to be sneered at. It's like, it's such an important part of the growth of the sport of fitness. Online comps are offering amazing prizes, like absolutely unbelievable prizes. I mean, last Friday I was involved in the Bay Games. I was very happy to be there. And like I said, this is not meant to be a promo for any competition. They had a prize purse of over 30K. 30K. Like the Rogue Invitational, which was won by Matt Fraser and Tia Claire Toomey, had 50K, and they've got 30K. It's like, oh my God. Like, have a look at these online competitions. And, I think if you're really keen to go pro or semi-pro, and some people might be like, I don't want to go pro CrossFitter, but there's a lot of people out there that should really consider, like, right, I see competitions here and I see the ability to make some good cash for myself. I think like that should definitely not be discounted. I mean, personally, I've never thought about making money out of competing in a competition. Like, one, I'm not good enough, but two, I just do competitions because I find that they help me with adding intensity into my training, and that's why I do them. But holy moly, if I got to the end of a weekend competition and I was sitting in third place and they said, oh, by the way, you've won $2,000, I'd be like, okay, I'll definitely come back to this comp. So that's the big characteristic of an online competition that I see, which is super valuable. And I guess that the reason for that is that a lot of those online competitions, they don't have massive amounts of overheads. I'm sure they have overheads, and they can have huge participation. So that's sort of how that's working. Okay, team, this is a bit of a ramble, but it's an interesting space right now, and I just feel like the thing that you should do when you're interacting with a competition as either an athlete or a coach is think to yourself, right, what type of experience is this competition going to give me or give this athlete, and is that the experience that they need right now? And then you make a really informed decision about the competition. Now, within each of these categories, obviously, there's different competitions which would do what I've said better and do different things within that. But hopefully that gives you some sort of scope as to what to aim for, because often I see athletes just saying, I want to compete, and then the competition that they choose to compete at or the way in which they choose to compete doesn't give them the experience that they're looking for. And I think if we think more about that, one, we'll get better experiences for athletes and coaches at competitions, and two, we'll start to refine our competitions to offer the experience that we want. I know for a fact that in the last competition that I was involved planning in, which was at CrossFit Richmond, that's called the Grassroots Competition, we were like, we want this to be old school. Throwing down in a gym, people who have just begun CrossFit versus people who have been to the CrossFit Games. We want to create some workouts that'll put everyone on their back and have people high-fiving. And we weren't obviously trying to give away crazy prizes. Prizes were okay. But we weren't necessarily trying to send anyone to the CrossFit Games. It was just like, let's have a kick-ass time and go old school on this thing. Guys, that's all I've got for you this week. I've got an exciting interview coming up next week. For now, keep converting pounds to kilos.